Welcome to our journey into the captivating world of the book of Ezekiel. In this ancient prophetic masterpiece found in the Old Testament of the Bible, we'll embark on an adventure filled with visions, powerful messages, and profound insights from the prophet Ezekiel. Chapter 1. Ezekiel's Vision of God's Glory. In this chapter, Ezekiel describes a breathtaking vision he received in the 30th year of his life and the 5th year of the Babylonian exile. He sees a storm cloud approaching, radiating flashes of lightning and surrounded by a brilliant fire. Within the storm, he witnesses 4 living creatures, each with multiple faces and wings, moving in perfect harmony with wheels beside them. Above them, Ezekiel sees a throne that resembles a sapphire. This vision reveals the majestic and awe-inspiring glory of God and sets the stage for Ezekiel's prophetic mission. Chapter 2. Ezekiel's Call and Commission. In this chapter, God calls Ezekiel to be a prophet to the rebellious people of Israel, who are in exile in Babylon. Despite the people's resistance, God promises to be with Ezekiel and make him strong. He warns Ezekiel that the people might not listen to him, but he must faithfully deliver God's messages nonetheless. Ezekiel is given a scroll to consume, symbolizing his acceptance of the divine message and his role as a spokesperson for God. Chapter 3. Ezekiel as a watchman. In this chapter, Ezekiel is appointed as a watchman for the house of Israel. As a watchman, he is responsible for warning the people of impending judgment and calling them to repentance. God assures Ezekiel that even if the people reject his message, he must speak fearlessly and boldly. The chapter also describes a symbolic act where God makes Ezekiel's forehead as hard as flint, signifying his determination and strength in the face of opposition. Chapter 4. Symbolic Actions of Judgment. In this chapter, God instructs Ezekiel to perform symbolic actions to represent the coming judgment on Jerusalem. He is commanded to lie on his left side for 390 days, symbolizing the iniquity of Israel, and on his right side for 40 days, symbolizing the iniquity of Judah. During this time, Ezekiel must also eat bread made with defiled ingredients, representing the scarcity and impurity that the people will experience during the siege of Jerusalem. Chapter 5. Jerusalem's Judgment and a Remnant Preserved. In this chapter, God continues to communicate his judgment on Jerusalem. Ezekiel is commanded to shave his head and divide the hair into thirds. Each portion represents a different aspect of the judgment that will befall the city: famine, sword, and dispersion. Despite the severity of the judgment, God promises to preserve a remnant of the people. The judgment on Jerusalem serves as a warning to the surrounding nations, who have also turned away from God. Chapter 6. Judgment on Idolatry and the Restoration of the Remnant. In this chapter, God pronounces judgment on the idolatry that has infiltrated Israel. The people have turned away from God and worshipped idols, particularly on the high places. God declares that he will destroy their altars, idols, and places of worship. However, a remnant of the people will be spared and brought to repentance through the judgment. They will recognize God's sovereignty and return to him. Chapter 7. The Impending Destruction of Jerusalem. In this chapter, Ezekiel delivers a powerful message regarding the imminent destruction of Jerusalem. The city's inhabitants, including the leaders and priests, will face the full wrath of God for their wickedness and abominations. God declares that he will not spare them or listen to their cries, as their sins have filled the land. The day of reckoning is near, and there will be no escape from the destruction that awaits Jerusalem. Chapter 8. Idolatry in the Temple. In this chapter, Ezekiel is transported in a vision to the city of Jerusalem, where he finds himself standing at the entrance of the north gate of the temple. There, he witnesses shocking scenes of idolatry and wickedness being practiced by the leaders of Israel. He sees an image of jealousy, which is most likely an idol representing a foreign god, placed in the inner court of the temple. This sight angers God, for the place meant for worship has been defiled by idolatrous practices. As Ezekiel is taken to the door of the temple's sanctuary, he discovers a group of 70 elders of Israel worshiping various idols, with smoke rising from censers. The Lord reveals to Ezekiel that these elders have turned their backs to him, engaging in abominable practices within his own temple. The vision continues as Ezekiel is shown women mourning for the god Tammuz, another form of idolatry in the temple. Furthermore, he sees men worshiping the sun, bowing down to it on the temple's eastern side. God declares that he will deal with these unfaithful people, showing them no pity for their wickedness and idolatry. The vision emphasizes the extent of corruption and unfaithfulness among the people and foreshadows the impending judgment that will come upon Jerusalem. Chapter 9. The Marked for Slaughter. In this chapter, God commands 6 men to go through the city of Jerusalem with deadly weapons. Among them is a man clothed in linen, carrying a writing case. God instructs the man in linen to mark the foreheads of the righteous with a mark, distinguishing them from the rest of the inhabitants. Then the judgment begins with God's command to the others to strike down those who have not received the mark. God's wrath is poured out on the city for the abominations and sins committed by its inhabitants. The righteous, those marked by the man in linen, are spared from the judgment, while the rest face the consequences of their unrepentant hearts. Chapter 10. The glory of God departs. In this chapter, Ezekiel witnesses another vision in which the glory of God, represented by the cherubim, departs from the temple in Jerusalem. The same heavenly beings Ezekiel saw earlier, with wheels and covered in eyes, are now seen moving away from the sanctuary. The glory of the Lord hovers above the cherubim and then positions itself at the entrance of the east gate of the temple. As the glory of God moves, the threshold of the temple is filled with a cloud, and the court is illuminated with the brightness of the Lord's glory. The sound of the cherubim's wings can be heard throughout the temple. The vision symbolizes God's withdrawal of his presence from the defiled and rebellious nation of Israel. It marks the culmination of his judgment on Jerusalem due to their persistent idolatry and disobedience. Chapter 11. Judgment on wicked leaders. In this chapter, Ezekiel receives a vision of the wickedness among some of the leaders of Israel who are in exile with him in Babylon. These leaders were giving false prophecies to the people, assuring them of peace and prosperity, despite their rebellion against God and their idolatrous practices. They believed that God had forsaken Jerusalem, leaving it to their control. However, God reveals to Ezekiel that he knows their hearts and their evil intentions. As a result of their corruption and false prophecies, God declares judgment on these leaders, and many of them will die in Babylon. Despite this judgment, a remnant of faithful people will be preserved and return to their land in the future. This chapter emphasizes God's knowledge of the heart and the accountability of leaders for their actions. Chapter 12. Symbolic actions of exile. In this chapter, God instructs Ezekiel to perform various symbolic actions to illustrate the forthcoming exile of the people of Judah. Ezekiel acts out the actions of a person going into exile, carrying his bags and digging through a wall to escape the city secretly. This represents King Zedekiah's desperate but futile attempt to avoid Babylonian captivity. The people around Ezekiel question the meaning of these actions, and God uses them as a sign to the exiles, demonstrating that their exile is inevitable and imminent. These symbolic actions serve as a vivid warning of the consequences of the people's rebellion against God and their refusal to heed the prophetic warnings. Chapter 13. Condemnation of false prophets. In this chapter, Ezekiel delivers a stern message against the false prophets in Israel who have been misleading the people with false visions, lies, and deceptive divination. These prophets have been assuring the people of peace and prosperity, even though the nation is facing God's impending judgment for their sins. God denounces these false prophets, declaring that they are preaching lies and leading the people astray. He promises to bring judgment upon them and their false prophecies, showing the people that he is the true and righteous God. God calls the people to turn away from these false prophets and seek the truth in his word. Chapter 14. No intercession for the wicked. In this chapter, some of the elders of Israel come to Ezekiel seeking a word from God. However, God tells Ezekiel that these elders have set up idols in their hearts, and they are still holding on to their idols even as they seek his guidance. God declares that he will not listen to the prayers or pleas of those who have turned away from him and are seeking his help while still cherishing their idols. He emphasizes that those who have chosen to follow idols instead of him will face the consequences of their choices. God reiterates the importance of true repentance and turning away from idolatry to receive his mercy and grace. Chapter 15. The Useless Vine. In this chapter, God uses the analogy of a vine to illustrate the uselessness of the people of Israel, who have turned away from him and embraced idolatry. Just as a vine has value only when it produces fruit, the people of Israel have lost their value to God due to their unfaithfulness. God compares the people of Jerusalem to a vine that is only suitable for being burned as fuel because of its lack of fruitfulness. He emphasizes that Jerusalem and its inhabitants have become spiritually barren due to their unfaithfulness and idolatry. As a result, God declares that he will execute judgments upon Jerusalem, leaving the city desolate and its inhabitants facing the consequences of their unrepentant hearts. Chapter 16. A parable of unfaithful Jerusalem. In this chapter, God uses a parable to depict Jerusalem's history as a wayward woman. He compares the city to a forsaken infant whom he found in its blood and raised to be beautiful and prosperous. However, as the city grew, it turned away from God, committing spiritual adultery by worshiping idols and engaging in wicked practices. Despite God's abundant blessings, Jerusalem pursued alliances with pagan nations, becoming even more unfaithful. As punishment for her idolatry, God withdraws his favor and brings judgment upon the city, exposing her shame and disgrace. Chapter 17. The Eagles and the Vine. In this chapter, God uses another parable to illustrate Jerusalem's unfaithfulness and her failed political strategies. The parable involves two eagles and a vine. The first eagle represents Babylon, which took Judah's king and nobles captive. The second eagle symbolizes Egypt, to which Judah turned for support, seeking political alliances instead of relying on God. God pronounces judgment on Jerusalem and her unfaithful leaders for their rebellion and trusting in worldly powers instead of him. Chapter 18. Individual responsibility and repentance. In this chapter, Ezekiel addresses the popular proverb in Israel that blames their current situation on the sins of their ancestors. God refutes this notion, emphasizing individual responsibility for sin. He explains that the righteous will be rewarded for their faithfulness, and the wicked will be judged for their sins, regardless of their family background. God calls for repentance and assures that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but desires that they turn from their evil ways and live. Chapter 19. A lament for the princes of Judah. In this chapter, Ezekiel presents a lamentation for the princes of Judah, expressing sorrow over their downfall and the loss of their royal line. He compares Judah's royal line to a lioness and her cubs, but the princes fail to live up to their potential. Instead of leading with wisdom and righteousness, they engage in alliances with other nations, leading to their downfall. The chapter ends on a somber note, reflecting on the tragedy of Judah's failed leadership. Chapter 20. Israel's history of rebellion and God's mercy. In this chapter, Ezekiel recounts Israel's history of rebellion against God, starting from their time in Egypt, through their wilderness journey, and into the Promised Land. Despite their continuous disobedience and idolatry, God's mercy is evident, as he refrains from destroying them entirely. He spares a remnant, promising future restoration. However, God also declares that the rebellious generation will not see the Promised Land. Chapter 21. The Sword of God's Judgment. In this chapter, Ezekiel delivers a message about the sword of God's judgment. He portrays God as sharpening his sword to bring judgment upon Jerusalem and Judah, as well as other nations. The Babylonian invasion will serve as God's instrument of judgment against the wicked. God reveals that even the king of Babylon is an agent in his hand, appointed to execute his judgment. Chapter 22. The Sins of Jerusalem. In this chapter, Ezekiel presents a vivid description of Jerusalem's sins and corruption. He accuses the city's leaders of shedding innocent blood, engaging in idolatry, and oppressing the people. The priests, prophets, and officials are also guilty of profaning God's sanctuary and disregarding his laws. God's judgment is imminent, and Jerusalem will be purified through the refining fire of his wrath. Chapter 23. A Tale of Two Sisters, Oholah and Oholibah. In this chapter, Ezekiel tells a metaphorical tale of two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, representing Samaria, the capital of Israel, and Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, respectively. Both sisters become unfaithful, engaging in idolatry and alliances with other nations. God uses this allegory to condemn the idolatry and unfaithfulness of both Israel and Judah, as they turned away from him to pursue worldly pleasures and alliances. The chapter ends with the declaration of God's judgment on both sisters for their spiritual adultery. Chapter 24. The Boiling Pot and the Death of Ezekiel's Wife. In this chapter, Ezekiel delivers a prophecy against Jerusalem, symbolized by a boiling pot. The pot represents the city's wickedness and corruption, and God declares that his judgment will come upon Jerusalem like the boiling contents of the pot. This prophecy is followed by the death of Ezekiel's wife, which serves as an illustration of the grief and mourning that the people will experience when the Babylonian siege leads to the fall of Jerusalem. God commands Ezekiel not to mourn publicly for his wife, as a sign of the coming calamity and judgment.